Thank you for coming to the Marines Memorial. This is a living memorial to honor all of those that have served and to educate the public on that service. I'd like to be the first to thank you tonight for writing this book and for pulling it all together, and also to be one that says that this book doesn't speak to just the Naval Academy and the class of 2002. It really speaks to an entire generation of service members. So thank you very much, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Ian. Thank you for hosting us. Thank you, General Myatt. Thank you to the Marine Memorial Association. My name is Lieutenant Commander Josh Welle, and I'm an active duty naval officer and the lead on this important book called In the Shadow of Greatness. I'm joined by my co-authors, Lieutenant Commander John Cauthen, who's a pilot and is stationed in the area, my co-author Rachel Torres, whose brother was a member of my class and you'll hear about tonight. And I'm honored to share with you an important story, not just for our great Navy and Marine Corps, but for the country, so that they understand what leadership meant for a generation after 9/11. So this will be a different book talk. We have some videos and we have some readings. I hope it's really compelling. So let me ask to move into why we wrote the book. Why we wrote the book. This book, In the Shadow of Greatness, was written to capture a story that had never been told. Stories of sacrifice and service that you would never read in the New York Times, never read in the Washington Post, and a story that was validated in my mind by a man named Ben Wagner. Ben Wagner was the brigade commander at the Naval Academy when we graduated. He was in charge of 4,000 people, and he was an enlisted Marine prior to his acceptance as a Lance Corporal. And he was the guy who, even though he was your peer, you really tried to stand a little straighter when you were near Ben. You tried to shine, you were frustrated your shoes weren't shiny enough or your haircut wasn't tight, because he was the litmus test for what was ethically right and good in officership. So I show his picture here because it's from the book and he writes, but I need to tell you that getting Ben Wagner to write for this book was not easy. I was in Afghanistan in 2009, a surface warfare officer. For those who don't know what that is, it's a guy on a ship sailing the 7 seas, advancing what the Chief of Naval Operations would say deterrence or power projection. And Admiral Greenert, God bless his soul, has now declared our book on the CNO's reading list for 2013, mandatory reading for our entire Navy. So as a SWO in an Army uniform doing governance and reconstruction and agricultural development, I said, this is really interesting. I should write a story about Josh Welle, the SWO, who's now in Kandahar, and all the neat things I'm doing. How could I possibly write a story about Josh when classmates like Ben had led 2 platoons in Iraq and 1 company in Afghanistan, saw shipmates killed, led at the crucible at the tip of the spear? How could I write a story about Josh Welle when Jason Consalvi saved a Stryker battalion in his F-14? Or how could I write a story about Josh Welle when Matt Freeman, who we'll talk about tonight, volunteered from Okinawa and served in harm's way and was ultimately killed? They were my classmates. This was a generation of leaders who, on 9/11, woke up and matured and were forced into a war that we had not seen since Vietnam. So I said, perfect. I'm the class president of USNA 2002, and I'm a social butterfly, and I know all these people, and I should connect all the dots. So I embarked on this project, and I had to check with Ben first. So I Skyped him. I Skyped him from Kandahar City, and I said, Ben, I want to write a book. Oh, no. Come on, Welle, you don't want to write a book, do you? You know I hate those things. They're out there. Some are bestsellers, and they're great. But he did not feel that he wanted to be a part of something like that. I said, this one's different. This is for all of our classmates that represent a generation of leaders, that everyone would have a voice. People who were way too humble to write would have a podium to share their story. He goes, I like it. I said, Ben, I want to go out to our classmates, all 980, and solicit their vignettes of leadership. And I want to weave them into a book that would show America how the Navy and Marine Corps served out of 9/11, and so it would be captured and never forgotten. We'd honor those who gave the ultimate sacrifice, and we'd leave something for the history books. He said, I'm in. So you understand now why we wrote the book, I'm going to tell you briefly on how we wrote the book. And I'll share a bit from Carol Anderson's story that praises her son Richard, who was killed in a helicopter accident in Fallon. So you have to understand that this book was written with great humility. The co-editors, Graham Plaster and John Ennis and Kate Krantz, we were all a core team, and we led a larger body of writers, people who struggle to write to find their voice. And I had a special connection with the mothers who wrote for this book. I reached out to them in a very delicate way, saying that we want to honor their stories. So I called Carol Anderson. I said, "Ma'am, my name's Josh Welle. I'm president of the class of 2002. I'd like to talk to you about something. Are you selling t-shirts?" "No, ma'am." "Are you selling sweatshirts?" "No, I'm not, ma'am. I'm talking to you about a project about Richard, and we'd like you to share your voice, your story of what it meant to lose a son in operations." She goes, "I'll call you back in a week." She did, and she took 2 years to finalize her story, to put into words what it meant to lose a son and still remain strong. I want to share with you words from her story and then something that was really powerful when she sent an email to our team. In the last paragraph of her story, which is titled, "Sometimes Dreams Do Come True," she talks about how one night she had a dream that her son was killed. And shortly thereafter, the chaplain came to the door with that awful news. In the last paragraph, she says, "Strangely, when Richard was still at the academy, he called me one day about his class ring order. He had requested to have his ring engraved with his name and the words, 'May God grant you strength, wisdom, and a long life.' Richard had said that the engraver could not accommodate all of these words, and so it would only have the words, 'May God grant you strength and wisdom, no long life.' And he did." Carol writes, "I don't pray anymore. I'm not yet ready, but I do wish fair winds and following seas to all those of his shipmates and to Richard, our beloved son, wherever he may be." And when she finally grabbed the book, she said, "I am so honored to know that Richard is somewhere other than a tombstone, that he will be remembered and his story will inspire for years to come." So this book was written with great humility, acknowledging the ultimate sacrifice of thousands, not just our classmates, and in a way that hopefully will inspire civilian service and military service and keeping our country strong. Next slide. Rocky Cheka. The book is divided into themes. So it's not chronological, it's more by themes, and each of my co-authors will share some of that. Rocky was an interesting co-author, not as hard to work with as Carol, I'll be honest with you. He was a company mate, and I called him one day, and I knew he was a casualty evacuation pilot. So in Iraq and Afghanistan, our generals cared a lot about the time a wounded warrior would be evacuated by these CH-46s. So I called Rocky. I said, "Rocky, I'd love you to write this book. Would you do it?" He said, "Josh, come on. I'm a Navy linebacker. I did very poorly in English. I can't write for this book." I said, "Rocky, we're a team of editors, and we're going to get you there. Please give us 3,000 words." So he submitted 6,000. I said, "Rocky, you're a Marine. I thought you followed directions." And he said, "No, I just have so much to say. So much of what it meant to fly into harm's way and pull these Iraqis, these Army soldiers, these Marines, these sailors out of harm's way." So I want to share a quick paragraph from Rocky's story. It's called "Evacuated the Injured" from Rocky Cheka. "I distinctly remember evacuating a Navy SEAL on my second deployment in 2006 from Combat Outpost Ramadi. He was the first SEAL killed in action in Iraq. One of his fellow SEALs came with him on the flight when he picked him up. He had a severe gunshot wound to the head and face, but was alive during the transit. He succumbed to his injuries after we dropped him off, and it became quite clear to me very early on that no one was invincible here, not even a SEAL." 16 Navy SEALs graduated in the class of 2002. How many of those Navy SEALs do you think wrote for this book? 0. 0 Navy SEALs wrote for this book because there's an ethos within that community that you don't talk about what you do. So just two of them, Ben and Nick, were my close friends. One I played soccer with. I said, Nick, we need you to write for this book, my friend. You were in an IED attack. You earned a Purple Heart. What about your chief? What about your petty officers, what they did? We want to make sure this is almost as good as No Easy Day. We want to get up on that ranking, because I almost think I could foreshadow it. He said, Josh, I'm sorry, my friend. I'm not writing for your book. So we're number 2 behind No Easy Day. We call this, Anita Brenner, what would we call this? No Easy Decade. But I do want to take a few seconds to talk about one Navy SEAL classmate, Dan Cauthen, who we referenced in the conclusion. If you know anything about Dan Cauthen, he's a hero. And he, too, did not write for our book. Dan, in September of 2009, lost both of his legs in turnover with another SEAL unit in Marja. Marja is in Helmand, Afghanistan, in the southern region. He was only there for a week, and he stepped on a pressure point IED, and he lost both of his legs. His sister and his mom quit their job, moved to Bethesda to nurse him back to health. Within 2 years, he ran the New York Marathon in less than 3 hours. On his prosthetics, he is now training for the 2015 Olympics in Colorado. We acknowledge him in the conclusion. We talk about the integrity of these 16 SEALs who did not write for the book, for respect for their great community. And we're just honored, and we turn to Dan as a hero in our class. Next slide. And now I'd like to invite Rachel up to talk about leadership.
Thank you, Josh. My name is Rachel Torres. I'm very excited to be here today. My mother Anita Brenner, and I co-authored a chapter about my brother Andrew Torres. That chapter is called Selflessness from the ICU. And although I'm an author for this book, I'm also civilian. And one of the themes of the book being that this is how leadership happens. This is what leadership looks like. For me, that's very interesting. I work here in the city for a mobile security startup, and there's a lot of exciting things going on in Silicon Valley, and the types of leadership I'm developing and that I see from my bosses and my coworkers, it's astounding. But at the end of the day, it's about downloading more apps, right? And the kind of leadership sacrifices and challenges that the grads of the Naval Academy face in the book, it's life or death. It's billions of dollars of equipment. It's a little bit different than the website I manage. So for me as well, reading the book has been a learning experience. And what I want to tell you about is Andrew's chapter really shows you like the kind of kid you got at the academy. Because where do these leaders come from? Well, they weren't always leaders. Once upon a time, they were 17, 18, 19-year-old kids. Ben Wagner, some of them were more mature, having been prior enlisted. But they were kids. And let me read you something that I think illustrates the spirit of adventure and desire for service, but, still a little bit, on the edge of being kind of a punk kid who watched Top Gun too many times. So the academy is very strict. How you keep your room is very strict. You can't have any personal effects. And they have enlisted people who are kind of like your advisor. And so Andrew's senior enlisted advisor was Gunnery Sergeant Curtis Sullivan. And Gunny Sullivan's official assignment was to counsel and advise the plebes of the 11th Company and to prepare them morally and mentally and physically to become professional officers, preferably in the United States Marine Corps. He was well acquainted with the roommates Fredland, Floyd, and Torres. The 3 roommates were bright, they were physically fit, and they were a constant challenge to their higher-ranking upperclassmen detailers. Torres, in particular, was viewed as a bit of a troublemaker. Barely 5 feet 7 inches, Torres had been the smallest player on his high school football team, and he didn't mind getting yelled at. And so when he wrote home during plebe summer 1998, he said, "I'm having an outstanding time. at Plebe Summer, which is not what most kids wrote home. So on this hot August day, Gunny Sullivan began the room inspection with a visual assessment to ascertain the material and sanitary condition of the room, which was poor. The inspection took a sudden turn for the worse when he saw a silver-framed, personal photograph. The Gunny glared at Torres and pulled out a contraband identification form. When he picked up the offending object for closer inspection, he noticed the genetically familiar swagger of another Marine from 32 years ago. It was Andrew's father, a young captain, standing a security detachment on the deck of USS Galveston, wearing dress blue sea, blue trousers with a red blood stripe down the leg, and a khaki long-sleeve button-up shirt. Gunny Sullivan squinted at the photo. The 3 rows of war ribbons were barely visible, but he noted a Bronze Star, jump wings, and a Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. Sullivan sighed, put down the photo, and tore up his paperwork. The photo would not be removed. So Andrew got away with that. And he got away with some other stuff too. And I think, in the book we talk about this story, and it shows how you got these really bright kids. Like, these are the best and brightest of our nation, and they want to have adventure, they want to serve their country, and they have this raw cleverness that just, puts them on the edge between like a good idea and a bad idea. And the Academy's job is to make sure that they go towards the good ideas and that they become men and women and officers and leaders going out into the fleet. But first, they're plebes. And so at Annapolis, you can have a sponsor family. It's a local area family who will volunteer that this midshipman can come to their house, wear civilian clothes, decompress, watch TV, eat junk food. And they have application process, and you write down, what your interests are, and then you get matched up with a sponsor family. And Andrew writes on his application, "I love cooking. Cooking's so important to me. Cooking with the family, getting together to eat a meal. It's just so important, and it's such a heritage for me as a Mexican Jew from California suburbs." And, there's a JAG officer serving at the Academy at the time, Captain Rick Stevens, and his wife Connie lived on the Yard on the Naval Academy campus. It's called the Yard, for my coworkers who are hearing about all these stories for the first time. And so they're like, "We are accomplished." Well, they didn't say that to themselves because they're pretty humble, like people in the military usually are. And they're like, "We are accomplished home chefs. This kid sounds perfect. Let's bring him in." So Andrew gets assigned to the Stevenses. He goes over there, he's eating ribs, he's eating mac and cheese, it's taco night, and they keep asking him, like, "When are you gonna cook for us? What, don't you wanna cook for us?" And he's like, "Oh, no, it's fine." And finally, Captain Stevens is like, so what's the deal? In your application, you said, "I love cooking." And Andrew says, "Yeah, I wrote, I love cooking because I wanted to get matched up with someone who loves cooking, because what I really love is eating." So Andrew got away with that too, and soon the Stevenses were cooking for all of Andrew's classmates and friends. And so Andrew's, obviously, he's my brother, he's, I'm his little sister. He's a great guy, but he's not exceptional, right, for the Academy. Like, this is the quality of cleverness and desire to serve that, is emblematic of all these graduates. And in his senior year, Andrew was diagnosed with cancer. And he had the cancer removed from his liver, and he got really sick, and he was recovering, and he decided he did want to graduate with his class, and worked his butt off and graduated in 2002. And he was commissioned as a Marine officer, managed to graduate, managed to get his commission, and he did die in 2004 from cancer. And you ask yourself, like obviously that's terrible, right? It shouldn't happen to anyone. So what's next? What's the legacy you leave behind? For me, I take a lot of solace and inspiration from how my brother lived his last years, his last days, and his whole life. So let me read to you a little bit more from the book. from Andrew's chapter, which appears in the Leadership Laboratory Fleet Tested section. Classmate Ryan O'Connell remembers, Andrew never said anything about the battle he was fighting. Our conversations were always about his life, that he was living, seemingly despite cancer, and never centered on his cancer or pain. So for Andrew, these tumors, they would disappear for a while, they would come back, there would be more surgeries, more treatments, new side effects. And in December 2003, a gunnery sergeant told Andrew, "Sir, you need to get your house in order." As things got worse, a high school friend asked Andrew, this is really important. A high school friend asked Andrew, "If you knew it would turn out this way, would you still have gone to the academy?" "Yes," Andrew said, "for the friendships." And when his illness ambushed him a second time, Andrew accepted the fact that this was not a battle he could win, and it was here that he showed a special form of leadership rooted in courage and compassion. And he had the courage to face reality, and even as he hung on with all his dwindling strength, to say fearlessly, "I am dying." And at the same time, he was reaching out to say farewell and try to comfort all his family, all his friends that he could reach. And what you'll read in The Shadow of Greatness is that people end up serving and sacrificing in ways they didn't expect. You go to the academy, you major in one thing, you want to be a pilot, you don't get to be a pilot, you get individually augmented to an Army unit. Things change. And these grads, they adapt. And for Andrew, he did experimental treatments that today are so effective compared to other treatments. They're so effective at saving lives that there's a billboard for one of them on the 101. It's a marketing tool. That's how good it is. And Andrew's sacrifice, Andrew going through those treatments, is part of his legacy. And now this book is part of his legacy. And Josh mentioned Captain Matt Freeman. This is another legacy that's really important and really inspiring. Matt's mother, Lisa, wrote a chapter called When No One's Watching. And this appears at the end of the book in a section called Integrity, Sacrifice, and Teamwork. And so Captain Freeman is someone who grew up in a Navy family. He dreamed of going to the academy and becoming a pilot. Again, a lot of Top Gun, I'm guessing. And he was commissioned as a Marine after graduation, and he became a C-130 pilot based out of Okinawa. And, as far as deployments go, it was not bad. He could go to Guam. His childhood sweetheart was also stationed at Okinawa, Teresa. She was an Air Force flight surgeon. And so, not bad, right? Like, you can spend time with your fiance, you can go on vacation, and you're doing the thing you always dreamed of doing, flying. And then Matt volunteered to be individually deployed to Afghanistan to augment an Army infantry unit that was working to train the National Afghan Army so that the National Afghan Army could take control of security in the country. So before he goes, he secretly marries his sweetheart. They elope. And again, Matt is someone who dreamed of serving his country, and he took very seriously, his responsibilities as an officer. He, read all these books. He read books before he went to Afghanistan so he could know more about the Taliban, so he could know more about the Afghan people, so he could know more about the history in that part of the world. And he had the example that, he had really taken to heart. As a midshipman, he heard General Krulak tell him, officers eat last. So he was always looking out for his soldiers. He would interact with the locals and got to know the people in the villages he was patrolling. And one day on a mission that he probably didn't really need to have to go on because he was an officer and didn't have to go on every mission, he went on patrol in a Taliban area to show that the U.S. military, had the confidence and ability to patrol this area, that, we are here. We are here and we're securing things. And so in the book, it says how they went out of base camp and up toward an area where they knew there would be danger. Recent intel had reported some 80 Taliban could be in the vicinity. Not more than 10 minutes into the patrol, shots rang out. Captain Freeman's team dismounted and cleared an enemy position in a mud house. Captain Freeman climbed atop the roof with one of his soldiers behind him, and Captain Freeman killed a man with an RPG during the ascent, who was aiming the RPG at his soldiers. Captain Freeman was visually acquiring a layout of the area and to call in air support when he was hit, and Captain Freeman fell, mortally wounded. And in an email he had written to his mother early on during his deployment in Afghanistan, he said, "Mom, the kids would rather have pen and paper more than anything else, even food or water. Would you please start a collection at your school and send them to me? I want to take the pens and paper to these Afghan kids so they can improve their education." So 6 months after Captain Freeman died, his mother Lisa and his family and his fiancée, secretly wife, started the Freeman Project, a nonprofit whose mission is to procure, ship, and distribute school supplies to the children in Afghanistan. And Matt was hoping that these pens and pencils would replace guns and grenades in these impoverished regions. To date, U.S. soldiers and Marines have distributed more than 3 tons of school supplies. The Freeman Project is one of the 8 charities for whom the proceeds of the book are being divided amongst these 8 charities. So when you buy these books, and I hope you'll buy more than one, and I hope you'll give them out as gifts and tell all your friends and coworkers about them. When you buy this book, you're helping carry on the legacy of people like Andrew and people like Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Good evening. My name is Lieutenant Commander John Cauthen. And what I'd like to talk about today is a perfect segue and is keeping with the theme of the book. What we also have here is the teamwork, the sacrifice, the honor, the integrity. None of that has ever gone away. That was something that was imbued within us from day one at the Naval Academy. And that theme ran strong and continues to run strong through former shipmates and current shipmates. At the Naval Academy, you have a variety of choices. Some elect to go aviation, others elect to go to the surface warfare community like Josh, and some elect to go to the submarine corps. Others elect to go to the Marine Corps. It's a motley collection, but at the end of the day, we all serve under that banner I just talked about. What we have here is an example that highlights what we were trained to do and what we were not trained to do. Courtney Sanini, for example, surface warfare officer, like many of my classmates, to include Josh and myself, volunteered to deploy to Afghanistan for reconstruction efforts to help the general population because they believed in the effort, they believed in the war, and they wanted to make a difference. Again, within keeping with that belief, that honor, that integrity, the sacrifice, and the teamwork. There was also another concept here that's becoming more and more relevant, especially in this day and age, the idea of what we call soft power. It's a complement to hard power, the traditional military strength that goes along with Marine Corps air wings, expeditionary strike groups, carrier strike groups, et cetera, et cetera. This soft power is perfectly embodied by what Courtney and others have done in Afghanistan. As she went out there, she was a female naval officer embedded with the Army who every day went out there against the odds, extreme bias, sexism, integrated into a culture that could not accept the face of a woman in uniform assisting and helping the very people that the Taliban were supposed to be fighting for. There's a beautiful story about her coming upon an accident of civilians and helping out the injured. And there was a woman, gravely injured, potentially, but nobody could discern what the problem was because she was covered from head to foot in a burqa. There were blood stains, and she was able to calm this woman down and bring her medical help because no one else was allowed to touch her. The men wouldn't let anything happen, and she wouldn't let anybody touch her because of those cultures, those cultural differences. And she, by that very fact, made a huge difference. And she discusses how this in many ways was a life-changing experience because it not only gave her an appreciation for what it was that we did every single day, but she also highlighted what America, in a microcosmic sense, can do in a larger macro sense. And on a personal note, because of this, she actually decided to become a nurse, which is an amazing transition from being a naval surface warfare officer. Next slide, please. Another element of this, in keeping with that theme in this very part of the book, is a gentleman by the name of Dave Augustine, submarine officer. The amazing thing about a submarine officer, if anybody has ever been friends with one, is you realize that they disappear from the very beginning to a deep, dark place, and they never emerge. They're responsible for turning valves, pushing buttons, and making sure that the submarine does not disappear because essentially that cargo, not just the personnel, but the nuclear missiles and the reactor itself, is extremely important and vital and potentially dangerous. Dave Augustine, he served with distinction, but then again, like others, volunteered outside of his warfare specialty to be a UN peacekeeper. I will tell you right now, from the day I graduated, the last thing I would have ever expected any of my classmates to do, branching off from their specialties, surface, submarine, aviation, would be to volunteer and go to a place like Liberia, to do just like Matt Freeman did, to do just like Courtney Sanini did, to offer hope, succor, and all of the power that comes with that soft power that the United States can bring, the influence, the material well-being, and the ideas. Dave Augustine did this, and he did it with great distinction. Next slide, please. The other element to this is the aviator. The aviator, as many as you probably well know, we can be sometimes brash, potentially a bit arrogant. But then there's that one day where you actually realize that you are mortal, that there is more to you as the pilot. And I think that day really occurred when, after Christmas, I woke up in a hotel with my squadron mates in Hong Kong, and the news channels were on, and there was a massive earthquake and tsunami off the coast of Indonesia. I thought nothing of it, didn't really factor. I won't give you the reasons why, but you can well imagine being alone in Hong Kong just after Christmas, exactly what was going on in my head and potentially my body. A more senior lieutenant said, "We're turning around." And sure enough, we got back on the ship, and within 12 hours, we went west. We steamed to Indonesia, and the entire time I couldn't think straight about why we were doing this when we were in the midst of a war, Afghanistan, Iraq. Here was a carrier strike group, the most awesome assemblage of power on the face of the planet, and we were going to an unknown region to help people because they were in distress. It made no sense to me. Once we got there, I fully understood the implications of this, and that's when I realized that there was more to the United States military, that there was more to the United States Navy and the Marine Corps than just that so-called hard power. This soft power, this display of beneficence goes along with the flag, the gray hull, and that power that you can project through aircraft, ordnance, missiles, et cetera, et cetera. It was really driven home to me because I was on the first flight in country, and when we went feet dry, crossing that shoreline, the shoreline had been completely transformed, which what was once lush jungle, rice paddies had been completely devastated and savaged by probably what amounted to a 100-foot wave. And if anyone can imagine the awesome power of water, especially as it's translated into a 100-foot wave, you can well imagine what this water did to the coastline of Sumatra. You get an idea here in the picture where there was once a village, and now we are landing on the road that went through the village. There are no houses, there are no structures. That was all of Indonesia. At the end of the day, the estimated body count just in Indonesia was roughly 200,000 people. The 4 people that I remember most embodying what we were doing, maturing me, giving me a greater perspective on what it was that the military does, were those 4 gentlemen down there. It's estimated that they were down, cut off, on an island that was created by the wave. What was once coastline had now become an island. They were there for 7 to 10 days. Once they came up to the aircraft, we realized, and I saw it in their eyes, the anguish, the suffering, the devastation of what they had experienced. And when the corpsman evaluated them, they were so dehydrated, I will never forget, he pulled up the skin on the top of their hand, and it stuck straight up and stayed there because they had barely any fluid in their body, and the skin slowly settled. We tried to give them food and water, and the corpsman had to stop us because they were so dehydrated we could have killed them. I'll never forget those eyes. They stick in my mind even to this day. And when Josh asked me to write this book, I'd kind of forgotten, maybe not forgotten, but at least shuddered away what I saw in Indonesia. And this really brought it home. And in some ways, it was actually a good experience. And it really made me realize, along with my other classmates, how important this endeavor was to highlight exactly what it is today's junior officers are going through and what they've done and what tomorrow's junior officers will do. And I think that's extremely important. Submarine officer, surface warfare officer, aviator, it does not matter. In this day and age, post-Cold War, in what we're calling the long war, you are going to be called upon to do a number of jobs that you were never trained for, but because you are an unrestricted line officer, you will step up to that responsibility and you will do it well, and I have every confidence that we will continue to do so. And I'd like to close by just reading a quick excerpt from my chapter, because this was more about just the learning experience of one young, brash aviator. It was 5,000 men and women on an aircraft carrier, 10,000 men and women within a carrier strike group, the expeditionary strike group that eventually showed up. And it highlights exactly what I mean by soft power. The men and women of CVW-2, Carrier Air Wing 2, the USS Abraham Lincoln, and Helicopter Anti-Submarine Squadron 2 proved that they were adaptable and could discharge any duty to which they were assigned. This mission was an unknown to all personnel, but each one would in many ways set the precedent for future humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations. Amid the ever-evolving landscape of conflict, threat, and natural disaster, the Navy and Marine Corps will continue to adapt and bring to bear its assets in support of any mission it is assigned. It was proven in Sumatra, validated in New Orleans, and employed most recently in Japan. It will continue to be an integral component not only for advancing U.S. interests and national security, but also for showcasing the nation's beneficence. I believe wholeheartedly that every one of our classmates and other junior officers continue to do this each and every single day, and I believe they will do that for as long as we have a Navy and Marine Corps. Thank you.
Next slide. This is the final day of an 11-day book tour around California, and it started actually in New York City. And in New York City last Monday, I showed this slide to an audience of 45 gentlemen over the age of 65. And a lot of eyes rolled. And I talked about patriotism and my friend Gary Ross. His story stands side by side all the other stories because it reflects one of the tipping point moments for our country, in that we are now looking for all patriots, and we are saying that it doesn't matter not only your religion, your ethnicity, or your sexual preference, but you can lead in this country. For 12 years, Gary was under a cloud of darkness. He had a partner named Dan. And when his XO said, "Hey, Gary, where are you going on leave?" He said, "Oh, I'm going with Danielle to Colorado." I said, "Gary, how are things at home?" "Oh, things with Danielle are fine." And he lied about who his partner was, and he couldn't be himself. But despite that, he went to Great Lakes and he trained boot camp sailors. He deployed multiple times and he served his country just like every other naval officer. And he's still serving today. So in last September, when Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen and the President said, we are going to repeal this policy, we need as many patriots as possible to serve in uniform, and they can lead with integrity, I called him and I said, will you write for the book? And he accepted, and you'll find one of the more patriotic stories in the book when you read about Gary. And we're just very proud of his service. Next slide. So all of these officers and all of these enlisted, I feel, when they serve in uniform, undergo a transformation. And I always talk about that to my department, that we have a duty as a wardroom to transform the lives of our sailors to become better citizens. And we talk about command, citizenship, and government. Excellence. After you leave the military, when you shed the uniform, what is your life's calling? So in the last section of the book, we talk about that. What's the next step when you hang up the uniform and you go off into civilian society? Well, we call on Seth Lynn's story because I think he is a perfect example of service. So he was he was a Marine serving in Iraq as an intelligence officer, and he said, I want to move on with my life. I want to go to Princeton and do policy. I want to be in politics, maybe. So while he was there, he was studying at the Woodrow Wilson School, and he said, damn, this red state and the blue state and the fighting and all the stuff I see on CNN, I'm so tired of it. When I was in the Marine Corps and I was in the Navy, we were just all about the teamwork. We're all about getting the job done and compromise and collaboration. So he felt we would be a better country if we had veterans in office. The municipal level, at the state legislature level, and at the congressional level, at the national level. Maybe we'd have presidential candidates with military service. Maybe we'd have people in the Armed Services Committee with military service. That number is dwindling. So he launched a 501c3 called Veterans Campaign. And for the last 3 years, they've trained thousands of veterans seeking office, seeking to tap into this political space. It's so hard to navigate when all you know are the general orders of the century and the plan of the day. When you leave the military, how do you transcend that? How do you break into these political world? Well, he's working with Chuck Hagel and other congressmen to train vets so they can transform this country for the better. It's a perfect story, and it's side by side other stories of those who said goodbye to the active duty military, but are leading in businesses and leading in schools and leading in the civilian sector. So this book ends, and I want to sort of transition and talk about the title. It's about our nation and achieving greatness. You'll see on the back cover, we're very excited because Admiral Mullen wrote the epilogue. Admiral Mullen was the former chairman. We also had Admiral Locklear, head of the Pacific region. Maybe he's spoken here. He wrote for the book. General Allen, our former commandant, wrote for the book. David Gergen from Harvard wrote for the book. And Tom Brokaw said it's a must-read. I've got awful news. Despite all those wonderful people, there is more security around Tom Brokaw than any of our 4-star admirals and generals. After months of support, we had wonderful endorsements for this book because they cared about its purpose and its role in shaping America and educating America. The book was modeled after The Greatest Generation, Tom Brokaw's best-selling book. Short stories that really capture the essence of leadership. You won't find this book anywhere else. It's never been written before, and I want to share with you the last paragraph. The greatest generation of the 20th century lived through the Great Depression and fought a two-front war. Our generation was called to defeat a faceless enemy and return to a country in economic turmoil. We aspire to be great, showing humility and respect for those who came before us. If we are to emerge from the shadows of our grandparents, we must persist with virtuous leadership on every battlefield and in every boardroom. From Baghdad to Washington and from Kabul to Silicon Valley, our commitment is resolute. Our nation's best days lie ahead. Thank you.
Leonard, Nita. Leonard Torres is a member of the Board of Directors of the Marines Memorial Association, as well as Leonard Torres' father. And Leonard, we'd like to make a presentation to you and Anita and to Rachel this evening from our board to your family. And if I could, I'd like to read from the award. Andrew was a remarkable person, blessed early on with a clear sense of self and clear sense of purpose. In a world in which so many people transit youth and even middle age while searching for their calling and purpose, Andrew focused clearly on what he wanted. He wanted to be an Annapolis graduate and a proud Marine, and that is what he became. And when he was knocked down and fatally wounded by his illness, he fought back valiantly, and like the leader that he was, he marched towards his goal as long as his strength remained. And so we're all very proud to be able to present this plaque and something you can hang in Andrew's bedroom in your home.